Hi there, my name is Dominique Dusek, and I'm the Assistant Director of Accessibility Services in our Office of Accessibility Services here at University of St. Francis. And I'm excited to share with you in our video today some of the basics of what is called universal design for instruction, or the idea of how you can proactively design your course to make it more accessible for the greatest number of students. As we get started today, I want to think about the role that accessibility actually plays in our everyday lives. So I have a couple of questions. First and foremost, do you use captions when you're watching TV or maybe streaming videos on YouTube? I certainly do. I am that person. I think watching a movie comes with the caveat that I will 100% turn on closed captioning. How about adjusting screen brightness on your phone or your text size when you're reading a website? Or how about using an escalator or an elevator when you're at the mall or in another large space? These are all examples of ways that universal design is actually all around us on a regular basis. And the concept of universal design was introduced in the 1970s by an architect named Ronald Mace. And in addition to being an architect, he was actually also a wheelchair user. And so he forefronted this idea that we should, in the design of things, consider how we can make them most accessible for the greatest number of people. And I have another example for you that maybe illustrates this a little bit more in a concrete way. What you see on your screen is an illustration of what's called the curb cut effect. And in the interest of being accessible, I'm going to take a moment to describe this image and what we see for those individuals who maybe are low vision. And so we have a number of stick figures outside in a public space. It maybe is a park, and one of these stick figures is in a wheelchair, another is rolling a dolly with boxes, two people are riding bikes, a couple people are seated on a bench, one of them has luggage, another appears to be using a cane, and there is a family with a small child in a stroller as well. And so the idea that's illustrated here, the curb cut effect, refers to or exemplifies the idea that when we design a space to be accessible for a person with disabilities, such as the individual here who's using the wheelchair, actually we make things better for everyone. We're allowing all of these individuals who maybe are wheeling something on a bike, have luggage, to also have better access. And so the idea of universal design really hinges on the idea of making something accessible for the greatest number of people and really building that into the design. Because when we are proactive, we really are allowing anyone to best access a public space or even the content in our course. I always try to model accessible practices so that you can easily implement them or integrate them into your courses. And so one really effective practice is to give students an agenda or a preview of what to expect. And so here is our preview of our workshop goals for today. By the end of our time together, you'll be able to define universal design for instruction and identify its key principles or its underlying philosophy. Anticipate barriers in accessibility for your courses, and identify some easy strategies for mitigating these barriers to make your classes more inclusive. As you may already be inferring, the idea of universal design hinges on this intention of optimizing accessibility for all individuals, regardless of ability status, their linguistic background, their socioeconomic status, or previous experience in higher education, through the design of a course or anything else really. But for our purposes today, we're really going to focus on higher education and instruction. And this is intended to be very proactive. And the reason that it is proactive is because we're anticipating barriers so that those individuals who may be experiencing barriers don't necessarily have to disclose them. This is important to note. We're not intending to replace the idea of accommodations. You will still have students in your courses who will have individual accommodations. However, it may minimize the need for those types of accommodations because you're making your course more accessible for the greatest number of people in its initial design and inception. And one of the ways we're really going to highlight for doing that is the key principles of universal design, really. Finding ways, in various ways, to present information, to allow students to engage in learning, and providing multiple ways of assessing that learning. I think one of the best ways to get started with universal design for instruction is to really root it in something concrete and to think about the circumstances that your students may face. And so I've included 3 fictional student profiles on this slide. And what I think is important to note is that these students are not real students at our university. However, they do represent the kinds of barriers that our real students face. And so these particular scenarios or situations that I'm about to describe are representative of many of the students that are registered with our Office of Accessibility. So our first student is Diego, who is a student with some hearing loss, who relies on captions and clear audio. Our second student is Maya. She's a multilingual student who is still building her academic English skills. And then our third student is Aisha, and she has significant social anxiety and really prefers flexible ways of participating in class. Additionally, she experiences extreme anxiety, especially related to public speaking scenarios. So now that you've read our student scenarios, I want you to think about potential barriers these students may experience in your courses and start to think about solutions. How can I, in my design of this course, incorporate ways of mitigating these barriers? And so I think it's best to start simple. Start with one course that you teach, take that syllabus, and mark it up. Where might Diego struggle? Where might Maya struggle? Where might Aisha struggle? And then start thinking, how can I use universal design, building ways into the actual design, the ways these students are engaging, the ways that these students are being assessed, the way that I am presenting information, to help mitigate some of these barriers. And so I'd like you to go ahead, pause this video, and think about that for a moment. And then I'm going to talk you through some examples of what I've found. So hopefully at this point you've had a chance to think about your syllabus for one of your courses and the areas that these students may struggle. And so some of what I came up with, just generally thinking about college courses and their structures, were these barriers. So specifically for Diego, I think about the use of media, right? The use of videos in class. And using videos is a great way to reinforce student learning through multiple modalities. I highly encourage it. However, this student may struggle if you don't provide videos with captions. So I would always encourage, like, make sure your media has captions, and if it doesn't, go ahead and create a transcript for that video maybe to provide to the student. And there are a lot of free apps where you can upload a video and generate a transcript that you can then go ahead and edit if you need to. Also consider maybe posting that video on your course shell so the student can revisit it later, maybe in a quieter environment, or rewatch it to discern anything that maybe he wasn't able to hear if it was shown in class. I also think about group discussions, because for individuals who are experiencing hearing loss, group discussions can be really challenging when there are overlapping voices and ambient noise. That actually really complicates things for individuals that maybe are deaf or hard of hearing. And so what I would encourage is to establish guidelines for discussions as you start setting expectations for how that should look in class. That's just a general good practice because you don't know what students' experience has been in high school or previous classes and what they think a discussion should look like. So establishing expectations, I think, is just a great best practice in general, but this will be really helpful for Diego because you're able to establish this expectation of one person speaking at a time. If you are speaking, ideally you're facing the class, and if needed, you might repeat student questions before responding to them, or student responses you think are particularly astute or meaningful, just to give Diego this additional opportunity to hear that. Another thing I would highly encourage, and I say this as someone that moves so much. You can see in this video I'm moving my hands because normally when I am teaching or presenting, I am moving around the room. That's really challenging for an individual who has some hearing loss. And so I think this would probably be a barrier Diego would experience in my class. And so I would try to be really mindful of facing the class when I am speaking, and also making sure that there are some other supports that Diego can access that will allow him to get that information. And so sharing my lecture slides is something that I would absolutely do and have done in the past, ideally in advance, so that maybe students can even print them and take notes on there, and even follow along visually as the lecture is evolving. So now let's think about Maya. So Maya's going to experience some barriers as a student who has limited English proficiency and is maybe still kind of acclimating or acquiring specific academic language. And so I think about the amount of times we use idioms or kind of colloquial phrases when we're speaking. Things like, it's raining cats and dogs. For a non-native speaker of English, the meaning of these kinds of language-specific expressions is not always clear. I also think about the kinds of jargon or really specific academic vocabulary we use in higher ed and in specific classes. And so again, I think it would be really important for Maya to get written supports. So to have slides posted, or maybe even a vocabulary list provided to her, to have transcripts similarly for videos so that she can go back and revisit them and maybe look up the meaning of unfamiliar words. I also would highly encourage, if a key term is very important, to take the time to really define that as a class, so that students have a shared understanding of what that word means. I think about lessons that maybe I would be particularly lecture-based, where I would be talking a lot, especially if I'm talking very quickly, right? For both Diego and Maya, that may be a challenge. So I would try to use really plain, clear language whenever possible. And again, posting those lecture slides or lecture outlines. It doesn't have to be your whole slideshow, but maybe just a bullet point of key takeaways for students. I think that would be really helpful both for Diego and Maya to be able to revisit. And if it feels burdensome to create that, one thing that I have seen at other institutions is assigning a different student to make notes at the end of each class. So you can have a student note taker assigned, or two for each class, and have them share their notes. Or after you do the lecture, take just a brief moment to highlight key takeaways and write them on the board or type them into a slide. It would take just a few additional minutes, and it would give all students a kind of a recap of the important highlights. I also think about the impact of high-stakes writing assignments if they are timed for someone like Maya. And what I would recommend, or how I would maybe amend my practices, especially as someone that taught English and language arts, do a lot of writing. Maybe there is some in-class timed writing. I would try to be flexible on the amount of time that I allow students to do that. And I would also make sure that I am incorporating various modes of assessing student learning. And so can this student also maybe do presentations or projects to demonstrate their learning? Is there a way of working in choice in terms of how the student demonstrates that learning? So if you are using in-class timed writing assignments, is it necessary to assess student learning in that way? Are there maybe some other various modes of assessing student learning that I can incorporate? And that isn't to say you can't do this kind of assignment, but offering variety in different types of assignments throughout the course is very valuable. Not everything should hinge on this particular mode of assessment. And then finally, we have Aisha. And so Aisha is someone with significant anxiety. I see this challenge more and more lately with our students. This seems to be pervasive. Students have a lot of social anxiety around speaking in class and also presenting. And so I think, first of all, required oral presentations would probably be a barrier for this student. And I would want to think about what some other alternative modes of assessing the student would be. So is there a way that students can use something like Flipgrid to record themselves speaking and post it and then respond to each other's videos? Is it possible to do small group presentations in the form of maybe a gallery? Is it possible that students can also maybe do written reports? So what is the value of having the student do an oral presentation? Does it have to be an individual presentation? Can it be a group presentation? Thinking about things like that. I also think that cold calling in class or randomly selecting students using that Socratic method could be really challenging for someone with social anxiety. And so when possible, I would probably try to incorporate opt-in participation strategies, allowing students to decide whether or not they want to participate or how they're going to participate, I think is a better way of saying that. But also, I think about allowing students some think time. A lot of times students have apprehension when they don't feel prepared. And so even just having students stop and jot down some thoughts before sharing can be very helpful. Having students maybe turn and talk to a peer before sharing out loud in a group or in a whole class format could be really helpful for Aisha. I also think that doing small group discussions and then having groups share key takeaways might be a little bit more of a comfortable format for Aisha. And again, this doesn't mean you can't have whole class discussions. It just means that varying these modes of discussion and participation can be really helpful. And that kind of brings me to my last thought in regards to Aisha, and that's when we kind of narrowly define participation as speaking out loud, are there other ways that she can show her learning? Again, can we use discussion boards or online posts? Can students post written reflections or complete written reflections or participate in small groups? One of the really impactful moments I had in college was I was in a seminar-based class, and what helped me to feel more confident participating was that we would create written responses prior to our discussions. We'd submit them to the professor. He would highlight the takeaways he thought were really profound or valuable, and then he would give those responses back to us. And so when I went into the discussion, I already knew maybe some key points that felt valuable that I could contribute. And if I was cold called, right, I at least had something in front of me that I could share. I felt prepared, and that made me feel comfortable. And so just incorporating maybe ways that you can help students to feel prepared and confident is what I think about when I think about Aisha's particular situation. Earlier in this presentation, we talked generally about the principle of universal design as it applies to various things, including the design of physical spaces and architecture. Universal design for instruction and teaching and learning is actually based on neuroscience and how different parts of the brain function. So the image that you see at the top of this slide of different parts of the brain highlighted really spotlights the different neural networks at play here. It's really fascinating if you want to do a deep dive, but I just wanted to highlight where this or these principles come from. And so in our examples of Aisha, Maya, and Diego, there are probably some common trends that you're gleaning. And so what those are really some of the key or foundational ideas as they relate to universal design for instruction, teaching, and learning. To reiterate those, the idea is that you want variety. You want to be able to offer materials, such as lecture materials, in multiple formats. Thinking about providing your slides in addition to speaking to students, thinking about providing transcripts for your media. It's also important to make sure that you're offering flexible options for students to participate and different ways of assessing students. You want to mix both high stakes and low stakes opportunities, maybe building in check-ins with students so that you can assess their learning before getting to assessments that are very high stakes or high impact. If you do have those larger projects like papers or presentations, you may wish to break those into smaller steps to kind of monitor students' progress along the way and to help them develop those executive functioning skills, because a lot of students may not fully comprehend how to organize a major project. They may need a little bit of scaffolding to get there, making sure that you're enhancing your lectures with different elements that are visual, like images, like videos, just reiterating concepts in a variety of ways so that students have different ways of engaging with those concepts that may be very complex, and looking at ways that students can be collaborative or share their ideas so that it's not just one means of assessment. It's not just providing oral presentations or writing in-timed class essays. There are different ways that students can demonstrate their learning. As we learned previously, universal design for instruction really emphasizes the idea of variety in terms of how information is presented to students, how students engage with that information either inside or outside of class, and how students are assessed. So I want this slide to act as a sort of reference for you in terms of how you can present information to students in varied ways. There are just a couple of different suggestions in terms of how you can incorporate both written and visual materials to illustrate core concepts, how you can use media in meaningful ways, but ways that also mitigate maybe some barriers that students like Diego or students like Maya might face if they have hearing loss or limited English proficiency, how you can give some structure to your lectures and solidify expectations, especially when you are presenting information in a heavily auditory way. We have to think about how we can enhance that, maybe through providing slideshows, summaries or outlines, guided notes, things like that. When illustrating complex processes, consider how you can model those processes or provide students with examples to really solidify their learning. Think about how you can integrate technology, especially as it pertains to student participation. Can you perhaps create pauses in lectures by giving students time to reflect using digital platforms? Can you assess their input and their understanding using something like Mentimeter or Poll Everywhere just to get a quick pulse of the room and see where students are at? And then how can you also maybe include some language supports so that students that maybe have a harder time with that key vocabulary get those vocabulary lists? They have glossaries accessible to them. You're using concrete examples to illustrate maybe things that are a little bit more complex, just as we did with the curb cut image. And so it's really important to note that this feels like a pretty comprehensive or exhaustive list, but what I want you to think about is where are maybe areas where I can incorporate one or two of these things. Small changes have a great impact on students, and essentially, accessibility is an ongoing or continuous process. So any ways that you can tweak your course are for the better. It doesn't have to be everything or nothing. Just maybe think about a couple of key takeaways from this. Similar to our previous slide, this slide is meant to act as a sort of reference for some strategies that you can easily include or incorporate into your course. And this one focuses more so on the aspects of student engagement and student assessment. So how you can incorporate some flexibility or variety in those areas. And I have it broken down by categories, so ways that you can maybe be flexible within how you structure discussions, how you structure assignments that students are completing, how you structure collaborative opportunities like group work within your class, and then how you perhaps approach presentations if those are a part of your course. And so to give you an opportunity to either save these or refer back to them later, you can email me at ddusek@stfrancis.edu, and I will provide you with a copy of this slideshow. And I'll also have a copy of the slideshow linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I greatly appreciate your interest in making your course more accessible for students, and I understand the challenges that can sometimes present and how overwhelming that can feel. Some key takeaways that we've talked about today are that accessibility benefits everyone. It's not just about your students that have a documented disability. It's for those students that have a disability that has never been documented, those students that are English language learners or are coming from a background where they are a first-generation college student and they have limited knowledge about technology or maybe some anxiety about some of these processes. Ideally, what we're aiming to do through universal design is to anticipate barriers and to remove them proactively, to allow all students multiple ways to learn and participate, and to really create a fair and accessible playing field. I recommend starting simple, picking just a few of these strategies we've talked about or previewed today, and seeing where you can implement them in one course. Even when you start small, those changes can have a really great impact on your students and on their learning. And that really gets at my final point, which is that accessibility is an ongoing process. Not everything is going to be revisable within a single night, within a single day, within a single semester. We always need to be learning and adapting and making changes that better our students' learning. So I greatly appreciate your interest in doing that. Absolutely. As you strive to make your courses more accessible and inclusive for all of your students, please know that you are not alone. I am always happy to support you and to answer any questions you have and troubleshoot any issues that you experience. And so you can see my email on screen. It is ddusek@stfrancis.edu. I'm located in Tower Hall N320. You can see my phone and text numbers as well. So my phone number is 815-740-3204. This is my last accessibility tip of this video. Give your students multiple ways of communicating with you and reaching out to you. Thank you again for your dedication to making your course more inclusive and for all the work that you do to provide students with a positive learning atmosphere. You're appreciated. Thanks again.